I felt the fear before anyone else did, and nobody believed me when I said so. It started with a small thing, because the big things always start with something small enough to ignore. A single listening drone, one of many thousands we had scattered across unclaimed systems at the edge of our territory, stopped sending its signal. There was no warning. There was no damage report. There was no burst of static before the silence, the kind that usually means a collision or a solar flare. One moment the drone was sending its usual report, a quiet stream of numbers about radiation and rock and nothing at all interesting. The next moment, there was nothing. I found it by accident, buried in a stack of routine reports that nobody else planned to read that day. My title at the time was Junior Analyst, Species Integration Office, which meant I spent most of my working hours reading reports that nobody else wanted to read. I almost skipped that one too. The drone sat above the third planet of a small yellow star, in a system we had not yet approached. We had thousands of small yellow stars, and thousands of third planets circling them, and most of them held nothing but rock and ice, and old radio noise fading into nothing. This one held something else. Our long-range surveys had picked up simple radio signals from it decades earlier, faint and repetitive, the kind any world makes before it grows up enough to matter. Nobody had been in a hurry to visit. There had been no reason to be. The species living there had not even left their own solar system yet, not in anything that could reach us, not in anything that could reach very far at all. I opened the drone's last file expecting nothing more than an equipment fault, a note I could close out in an afternoon and forget by evening. Instead, I found 6 years of a steady, healthy signal, and then, right at the very end, half a second of interference before the line went dead. Not decay, not slow failure. Interference, the kind you get when something passes close enough to a sensor to disturb it on the way by. I flagged it as unusual, the way I had been trained to do, and sent it up the chain for review. 3 days later it came back down the chain with a short note attached. Equipment failure, category minor, no further action required. I stared at that note for a long time, because I had already read enough drone failures in my short career to know what an ordinary one looked like, and this was not one of them. But I was young, and new to the office, and the note had come from someone senior enough that arguing with it would have cost me more than it was worth. So I let it go. I filed it under closed. I told myself I was wrong. I was not wrong. I only did not yet understand why. To explain what happened after that, I have to explain what we were, and what we had built, because none of it makes any sense without the shape of the thing we called the Accords. For nearly 1,000 years, our council had kept order across a great stretch of the galaxy by making sure no species we found ever grew strong enough, or united enough, to challenge it. We called this order the Tribute Accords, and on the surface, it sounded almost fair. Any species we discovered, once it reached a certain level of technology, was approached, studied, and given terms. In exchange for protection, guidance, and a formal place among the stars, that species provided tribute, resources from their world, access to any technology or knowledge that made them unusual, and workers, a fixed number of their own people sent away every year to serve the wider needs of the Council in places their species would never fully see or understand. Nobody called it what it was. We called it integration. We called the missing citizens placements. We had a gentle word for almost everything, and I had used every one of them without a second thought, because that is what training does to a mind. It teaches you which words to reach for, so you never have to reach for the honest ones. Every species that refused the terms of the Accords was corrected, and that word hid more than it showed as well. I will not pretend I understood, back then, exactly what correction meant in practice. I only knew that no species had refused in living memory. The official records on the earliest cases were sealed above my clearance level, which told its own kind of story. I had once searched for even a short summary, out of nothing more than idle curiosity, and had found only a single line confirming that a small number of species, in the first years of the Accords, had refused the terms offered to them. The line did not say what became of them afterward. It did not need to. The Accords had never been refused again in the 900 years since, and I had always assumed that was because every species eventually understood the wisdom of the arrangement. I had never once considered that it might simply be because nobody had tried. I had grown up believing in those gentle words, because my own homeworld had been brought into the Accords 3 generations before I was born, and by the time I was old enough to understand any of it, My people had already folded the arrangement into our history as something closer to a rescue than a surrender. We were taught that the council had found us at war with ourselves and had given us a wider purpose instead. I joined the integration office because I wanted to be part of that same guidance for other worlds. I did not yet understand how much of that story depended on which side of it you were standing on. The council itself was larger than anything my mind could hold in one clear picture. Thousands of member worlds sent representatives to the central chamber, a structure built into a hollowed moon that no single species could have built alone, layered with centuries of additions from 100 different cultures. Some delegates were people, in the sense my own species used that word. Some were something else entirely, breathing gases I could not have survived without an enclosure built specially for them, speaking through translation devices that turned their true voices into something the rest of us could follow. We were, all of us, held together by the same simple promise: obey the accords, and the council would keep the peace. Nobody in that chamber, on any ordinary day, spent much time wondering what would happen if a species decided the promise was not worth keeping. A season before the drone went quiet, I had been assigned to observe a placement departure for a species called the Ovrin, 3 systems over from my own home. I remember the platform more clearly than I remember almost anything else from that year. Long lines of Ovrin citizens, chosen by a lottery their own government ran on our behalf, stood with small bags of belongings, waiting for transport craft that would take them somewhere none of them had asked to go. Their families stood behind a marked line, not crying, because I was told their culture considered public grief a private failure, but very quiet, in a way that felt heavier than crying would have. An Ovrin official read out a short passage about duty and the wider good of the accords, and then the doors closed, and the ships left, and the platform went back to being an ordinary platform. Nobody on that platform raised a weapon. Nobody shouted. It was the quietest kind of taking I had ever witnessed, and for a long time afterward I told myself that quiet meant acceptance, and acceptance meant it was fine. I did not think about it again until much later, when I finally understood that quiet can mean a great many things, and acceptance is only one of them. I think about that platform more now than I did on the day itself. At the time, I remember feeling something close to relief that the process had gone so smoothly, since a smooth process meant no complications for my report. It took me a long time to understand that the smoothness itself should have troubled me more than any complication could have. A species that has been taught, over generations, that resistance costs more than it saves, will eventually stop calculating the cost at all. It will simply comply, the same way a river follows the shape of the ground beneath it, without ever deciding to do so. That was the system I served. That was the chair I sat in, 3 rows back from the front, in the great chamber, on the day a new survey report crossed my desk about a small blue world circling that same small yellow star, where a drone had once gone quiet, without any real explanation. The report called the species Terrans, after the name they used for their own home. It read the way every new species report reads in its opening pages: population figures, government structures, or in this case, dozens of separate governments that did not appear to agree with one another about almost anything at all, technology level, rated low by our analysts, since the Terrans had not yet left their own solar system in anything more advanced than simple chemical rockets. Military strength rated lower still, since none of their weapons could reach beyond their own world in any way that mattered to us. I remember the room laughing when that section was read aloud during the first briefing. Not cruelly, just easily, the way anyone laughs at something that poses them no danger at all. There was a second section further down the report that fewer people paid attention to, tucked under a heading called Historical Notes, the kind of section that exists mostly so nobody can claim later that the information was hidden from them. It said that the species had a long recorded history of conflict between its own separate groups, and that these conflicts tended to end in one of 2 ways. Either one side overcame the other completely, or both sides fought until neither one could continue, and even then, peace rarely lasted more than a generation before the same groups found new reasons to take up arms again. I read that section twice. I do not know why it caught my attention when it caught almost nobody else's. Perhaps it was the drone, still sitting quietly at the back of my mind, refusing to be filed away as neatly as I wanted it to be. Perhaps it was nothing more than the particular shape of the words, a pattern I recognized without yet being able to name it. I raised my hand during the formal classification meeting, 3 days after the report first arrived, and asked whether the historical notes changed our recommendation in any way. The presiding officer that day was an administrator named Corvath Ian, a broad, confident man who had overseen more first contact classifications than anyone else in the chamber, and who did not especially enjoy being questioned by junior staff. He told me, not unkindly, that every species we had ever catalogued arrived with some history of conflict among itself. That was, he said, the natural condition of any people before they were brought into a wider order, and it was the entire reason the Accords existed in the first place. We did not exist to judge a species by what it had been before we arrived. We existed to guide it toward what it could become afterward. I did not have a good answer to that. I am still not certain I do. A colleague of mine, an older analyst named Vesa Oren, who sat 2 seats down from me in every meeting we ever shared, leaned over during the recess and told me quietly that she had noticed the same section I had. She did not think it changed anything, she said, but she thought it was strange that a species so divided against itself had never once, in all its recorded history, simply given up. Every other species we had catalogued eventually reached a point of exhaustion, a point where continuing a fight cost more than it was worth. The Terran records did not show that point anywhere, no matter how far back they went. I asked her what she thought that meant. She said she did not know, and that not knowing was probably why nobody wanted to put it into an official report. It is far easier to classify a thing you can name than a thing you can only describe. The classification passed with no objections recorded, except my own quiet unease, which did not count as an objection, because I never said it aloud with enough force for it to matter. Terrans were filed as Category 7, a designation reserved for species judged capable of eventually contributing meaningfully to the Accords, while posing no meaningful threat of resistance. Below Category 5, the standard procedure was simple and unchanging. Deliver the terms. Wait the required 30 days for a formal response, as tradition and old law demanded. Proceed with integration. I mentioned the drone at the very end of that meeting, almost as an afterthought, more because I wanted it on some record somewhere, than because I expected anyone to take it seriously. I explained the interference, the 6 years of clean signal broken by a fraction of a second of static, directly above the very system we were about to approach with a formal order. Administrator Ian listened, nodded once, and told me that a single drone failure at the edge of unexplored space was hardly unusual, and that I should be careful not to let one broken sensor make me see shapes in the dark where none existed. Several people around the table smiled at that. I smiled too, because it was easier than not smiling, and because I still half believed he was right to say it. The order to proceed was signed that same afternoon. I watched the approval seal settle across the page, a soft shimmer of light rather than ink, and thought, quite plainly, that somewhere on a small blue world, orbiting a small yellow star, a species that did not yet know we existed was about to learn that it did not have a real choice in the matter. I went home that night and pulled the drone's final file up once more, alone, in the quiet of my own quarters. I watched that half-second of interference over and over, slowed down as far as the recording would allow, until it was nothing but a soft blur of color, with no clear shape I could name. I told myself, again, that I was imagining things. I was not imagining things. I only did not yet know what I was looking at. 3 weeks later, the envoy ship carrying the tribute order to the Terrans was ready to depart, and my supervisor, more as a courtesy than as any real honor, offered me a seat aboard it as a junior aide, since I had written most of the integration paperwork for the file myself. I said yes before I had given myself enough time to think about whether I truly wanted to. Vesa found me in the corridor the evening before the ship left, and asked why I had volunteered for a routine delivery run that most senior staff considered beneath them. I told her I wanted to see the Terrans for myself, before anyone decided anything more about them. She looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that carries more weight than words usually do, and told me to be careful about the difference between watching a thing and understanding it. I did not know exactly what she meant by that. I only knew that I did not sleep well that night, and that when I finally did sleep, I dreamed of a half-second of interference with no shape I could name. I did not know, when I said yes, that I was about to become one of the very few people in our entire council who would watch, from beginning to end, Exactly how a species could answer a demand it was never supposed to be strong enough to refuse. I did not know that the drone's silence had already told me everything I needed to know. If only I had understood the language it was speaking. I would understand it soon enough. We all would. The moment our engines went quiet inside the Terran system, I understood, for the first time in my life, what it meant to feel small. I do not mean that Terran space impressed me the way some other systems had. Their world was ordinary in almost every measurable way. A modest blue and white planet circling a modest yellow star, with a single pale moon, and a scattering of debris further out that our charts had already mapped 100 times before we ever arrived. What made me feel small was not the place itself. It was the silence. Every other species I had ever approached with a delegation of this kind filled that silence the moment we arrived. Their own ships would rush out to meet us, eager and anxious in equal measure, sending greeting after greeting, before we had even finished settling into orbit. It was, I had been taught, simple instinct. A species facing something larger than itself wants to be seen, to be heard, to prove it is worth speaking with, before anyone decides otherwise. The Terrans sent nothing. Our instruments confirmed there were ships nearby, small stations and a handful of vessels moving along quiet, ordinary paths, exactly where the survey said they would be. Nobody hailed us. Nobody moved to intercept us. It was as though we had arrived at a house where the owners already knew we were coming, and had simply decided to wait for us to knock. I kept glancing at the sensor readouts during those first hours in orbit, half expecting some delayed reaction, a scramble of activity once the Terrans finally noticed us properly. It never came. Their vessels continued along the same quiet paths they had been following before we arrived, as though a delegation from 1,000 worlds appearing above their planet for the first time in their history was simply one more scheduled event on an already full calendar. I had been trained to read fear in 100 different forms across 100 different species. I did not yet have any training in how to read whatever this was instead. Envoy Andres Kell, who led our delegation, and who had delivered terms of this kind to 11 different species before this one, found the silence encouraging rather than strange. He told the rest of us, gathered in the briefing room the morning we entered orbit, that quiet arrivals usually meant a frightened population keeping its head down, which suited our purposes well enough. I did not argue with him. I had learned, by then, that my unease was not the kind of currency that bought anything useful in rooms like that one. We had expected to propose a meeting time and wait through the usual round of delays that new species always requested, sometimes for days, once for almost a full month, while their leaders argued among themselves about how to respond to an invitation they could not refuse. The Terran Compact, a body we were told had only existed for a handful of weeks, replied to our first proposed time within a single hour, accepting it without asking for a delay of any kind. That detail bothered me more than almost anything else that happened before the meeting itself. A species meets us for the first time in its history, still arguing among its own many nations about nearly everything, and somehow finds the time to form one unified voice in a matter of weeks, then meets that voice with an answer inside of an hour. Envoy Kell called it efficiency. I called it, privately, in the small notebook I had started keeping without admitting to myself why, something else. I did not have the right word for it yet. The meeting took place aboard a station the Terrans had built themselves, in orbit above their home world, rather than aboard our own vessel as protocol usually preferred. Every other species had begged to meet anywhere except their own territory, afraid of what we might see if we were allowed too close. The Terrans invited us in without hesitation, and did not ask us to leave any part of our delegation behind. I remember stepping off our shuttle into a corridor built from materials I did not recognize, humming faintly with a kind of steady, competent energy that felt nothing like the survey's low technology rating had prepared me for. It was not advanced by our standards. It was simply solid, in a way that suggested people who built things to last, rather than things to impress. I noticed small things that the survey had never thought worth reporting. Doors that opened just before you reached them, timed by sensors reading footsteps, rather than any signal we transmitted. Lighting that shifted a shade warmer as we walked further from the shuttle bay, as though someone had studied which colors put visiting guests at ease, and had quietly built that study into the walls themselves. None of it was advanced in the way our own stations were advanced. All of it was deliberate, and deliberate, I was beginning to learn, worried me more than advanced ever could have. Owen Hale met us at the entrance to the main chamber. He was the liaison assigned by the newly formed compact to handle what their government called external affairs. A small, plainly dressed man with an unremarkable face and a voice that never rose or fell more than it needed to. He greeted Envoy Kell with the correct formal address, the exact phrasing our own protocols required, which meant someone on their side had studied our customs closely enough to get every syllable right on the very first attempt. Envoy Kell read the tribute order aloud himself, as tradition demanded. He listed the terms in the order they always came in. Full resource rights to the outer reaches of their solar system, the empty rock and ice that meant little to them yet, but would matter greatly to us. Complete access to any technology or method unique to their species, a term that felt almost absurd given how little they had to offer beyond the Council's own long-established knowledge, though tradition required it be asked of every species regardless of what they held. And finally, the yearly levy. 10,000 citizens, selected by whatever method their own government preferred, to be delivered each year for integration service, for as long as the compact remained a member of the Accords. I thought of the Overin platform while Envoy Kell read that term aloud. The quiet lines, the small bags of belongings, the families who did not cry because their culture had taught them not to. I tried to picture what a Terran platform built for the same purpose would look like, and found that I could not construct the image at all. Every attempt my mind made came out wrong somehow, like trying to fit a shape into a space that refused to hold it. I watched Owen Hale's face while Envoy Kell read that last term. I had watched other species receive that same demand during my training reviews, recordings kept for study, and the reactions were always similar. A flinch, a held breath, sometimes tears, sometimes anger, poorly hidden behind forced calm. Owen Hale's face did none of these things. He simply listened, the way a person listens to the weather report for a day they have already planned around. When Envoy Kell finished, he asked, as protocol required, whether the compact wished to raise any questions about the terms before the 30-day response period formally began. Owen Hale said that the compact understood the terms exactly as presented, and had no questions at this time. He said that a formal response would be delivered before the deadline, in accordance with what he called, and I remember this precisely because it struck me as strange even then, the customary provisions of the Accords regarding response windows. Envoy Kell, perhaps sensing an opportunity to remind the room of the true balance of power at the table, added an unscripted remark of his own before closing the session. He told Owen Hale that the compact should consider itself fortunate to be offered 30 days at all, since older and stronger species than his had been given far less consideration in their own first encounters with the Accords. He meant it, I believe, as a kind of warning, wrapped inside a compliment. Owen Hale simply nodded, thanked him for the information, and said nothing further on the subject. I watched several members of our own delegation exchange satisfied glances at that, mistaking silence for submission, the same mistake I was beginning to suspect we had been making since the moment we entered the system. Nobody on our side of the room reacted to that phrase in the moment. It was only much later, replaying the meeting in my memory, that I understood what should have troubled us immediately. The compact had existed for a matter of weeks. The Accords had existed for nearly 1,000 years, written in a language and a legal structure so old that most of the species living under it barely understood their own rights within it, let alone the specific provisions governing response windows. Owen Hale spoke about our law as though he had already read it closely, and found nothing in it that surprised him. I asked him about it directly, near the end of the formal proceedings, when protocol allowed a short period for informal remarks between delegations. I asked how his people had learned so much about the Accords in so little time. He looked at me for a moment before answering, and it was the first time since we had arrived that I felt he was truly looking at me, rather than simply performing the correct posture of attention. He said that his people had always been quick studies when something mattered enough. He said it without pride and without any warmth I could detect, the way a person states a simple fact about the weight of an object, rather than an opinion about it. I asked him whether the terms troubled him. It was not a professional question, and I knew it was not my place to ask it, but something about his stillness made the question rise up out of me before I could stop it. He said that 30 days was a generous amount of time to consider anything properly, and that his people intended to use every one of them. Our delegation's translation specialist, a quiet, precise woman named Fen Ashari, who rarely spoke unless her expertise was needed, caught my sleeve as we walked back toward the shuttle. She told me that the translation software had flagged something odd in Owen Hale's phrasing, a construction that did not quite match the confident simplicity of everything else he had said. He had used, she said, a very old and formal verb tense when he spoke about his people using every one of the 30 days, the kind of tense usually reserved in their language for describing something already decided, rather than something still being weighed. I asked her what she thought it meant. She said translation software could tell you what words a person chose. It could not tell you why they had chosen them. I did not know, standing in that corridor with its unfamiliar hum of steady energy, whether I had just heard the words of a frightened man hiding his fear extremely well, or the words of someone who had already decided something he had no intention of sharing with us yet. I have turned that question over many times since, and I am still not certain there is a difference between the two that would have mattered in the end. Envoy Kell was satisfied with how the meeting had gone. On the return journey, he told the rest of the delegation that the Terrans had behaved exactly as expected, a species too overwhelmed by the scale of what faced them to do anything but agree to whatever was asked. He said their calm was the calm of people who had not yet understood their own situation, and that understanding would arrive, as it always did, somewhere around the 20th day, when the reality of integration finally became real to them, in a way that words on a page could not capture. Fen Ashari, seated across from me during that debrief, asked quietly whether anyone else found it strange that a species with no prior experience of the Accords had used its exact legal terminology without a single mistake. Envoy Kell told her that translation always smooths over small differences, and that we were likely reading formality into what was simply a very good machine translation on their end. Fen did not push the point further, but she caught my eye across the table in a way that told me she trusted her own observation more than she trusted his answer. It was a small moment, easy to miss, and I have wondered since how differently things might have gone if a few more people in that room had chosen to notice it the way she did. I did not share his confidence, though I said nothing to contradict him during the debrief. Instead, once we returned to the central station, I requested access to the General Historical Archive on Terran civilization, the full record, rather than the summary our survey had prepared. My official reason, written on the request form, was routine background research to support the integration planning documents I would eventually need to draft. My real reason was smaller and harder to explain, something closer to an itch beneath skin I did not technically have in the places humans would have called skin. The archive granted my request within a day, since nothing about Terran civilization had yet been classified as sensitive. I remember sitting alone in the reading room that evening, expecting to find exactly what the survey report had already told me. Instead, within the first hour, I found a passage that stopped me entirely. It was a brief historical note, translated from one of humanity's own recovered broadcasts, describing a conflict from centuries earlier in their history, a war fought by a smaller group against a much larger one that had already claimed victory and moved on to accepting the terms of surrender. The smaller group had refused those terms, not because they believed they could win in any way that made sense on paper, but because, according to the note, they had decided that some terms were worse than losing. The note did not say what happened to them afterward. I found myself hoping, absurdly, that it had gone well for them, before reminding myself that whatever had happened, it had happened long before I was born, on a world I had never set foot on, to people who could not possibly matter to the report sitting open in front of me. A second note, filed centuries after the first, described an entirely different conflict, in a different part of their world, between groups that shared almost nothing in common with one another. Not language, not custom, not any of the divisions our own survey had used to separate one Terran nation from another. And yet the pattern repeated. A smaller side, offered survival in exchange for submission, chose instead to continue a struggle that cost them far more than compliance ever would have. I began to wonder whether I was looking at two unrelated events, or two examples of the same deeper pattern, appearing again and again across centuries, in populations that otherwise had little reason to behave alike at all. I closed the archive that night without finishing the search I had planned to run. I told myself I would return to it the next day, when I had more time and a clearer head. I did not tell myself the truth, which was that I was afraid of what else I might find, and even more afraid that Envoy Kell was right, and that all of it meant nothing at all. I spent the days that followed burying myself in other assignments, integration paperwork for 3 different species awaiting their own classification hearings, hoping that enough ordinary work would quiet the questions sitting at the back of my mind. It did not work as well as I wanted it to. I would find myself, in the middle of an unrelated report, thinking again about the old verb tense Fen had noticed, about the doors that opened before footsteps reached them, about a half-second of interference above a planet that had not yet learned any reason to fear us. Somewhere in that stretch of ordinary days, without quite deciding to, I made up my mind to return to the archive properly, and this time, to keep looking until I found either an answer or the end of what there was to find. I was wrong about that too. It meant everything. I simply did not yet have enough pieces of it in front of me to see the whole shape of what I was looking at. The deep listening post at the edge of Terran space stopped transmitting on the 11th day of the waiting period, and this time, I was not the only one who noticed. Unlike the drone, the listening post was not a small thing easy to overlook. It was a manned facility, staffed by a rotating crew of 6, built to watch several systems at once from a quiet position, far enough away that no survey had ever flagged it as a risk. Its last transmission arrived exactly on schedule, an unremarkable status report like everyone before it. Then, in the final fragment of data recovered before the signal died completely, the sensors recorded something passing close by. Not a shape our records could match to any known vessel, not debris, not a natural object, not anything the analysts reviewing the fragment could agree on. Simply a shape, there and then gone, followed by silence. One of the senior technicians, a meticulous man who had spent decades studying sensor anomalies, told the room that the shape's outline did not match atmospheric distortion, gravitational lensing, or any of the natural explanations usually offered for readings of this kind. He said carefully, that if he had to guess, the shape behaved like something built to avoid being seen clearly, rather than something that simply happened not to be seen clearly. Nobody thanked him for the observation. Several people in the room found reasons to leave shortly after he made it, one at a time, each with some small excuse about other duties waiting elsewhere. I understood, watching them go, that I was seeing something I would see many more times before the 30 days ended. Fear, when it arrives in a room full of people who have built careers on certainty, rarely announces itself directly. It leaves quietly, in small groups, and returns later dressed as a rational explanation nobody wants to argue with. This time, the report reached me through proper channels rather than by accident, because this time, enough people were alarmed enough to make sure it moved quickly through the office. I sat in a room with a dozen other analysts while a senior technician played the fragment for us 3 times in a row, slowing it down, sharpening it, trying to coax more detail out of half a second of distorted light. Nobody could agree on what we were looking at. Several people suggested it was almost certainly a rare stellar phenomenon, a trick of light bending around a body we had not properly mapped in that region. I noticed that the people making this suggestion were, without exception, the same people who outranked everyone else in the room, and that their explanation was accepted with a speed that had less to do with evidence and more to do with position. Director Passel Kaur, who oversaw my section of the integration office and who had approved my formal request to keep researching the Terran file, called me into her office later that same day. She was not an unkind woman, and I want to be fair to her in the telling of this, because it would be easy now, knowing everything I know, to make her sound foolish in a way she did not deserve. She listened carefully to everything I had found in the archive so far, the historical notes, the recurring pattern, the strange fluency Owen Hale had shown with our own legal language. She told me, when I finished, that she believed I had found something real, and that she also believed it did not matter nearly as much as I thought it did. She explained her reasoning patiently, the way a person explains something they have needed to accept themselves at some earlier point in their career. The Accords, she said, had survived 1,000 years by treating every species according to the same fixed procedure, regardless of what any individual analyst suspected about that species in advance. If we started making exceptions every time a junior researcher found an unsettling pattern in old records, the entire system would collapse under the weight of its own caution. Better, she said, to follow the procedure exactly as written, and let the procedure itself absorb whatever surprises came. I asked her what would happen if the procedure was wrong this time. She told me that the procedure had never been wrong before, and that this was not, in her experience, the kind of thing that changed on its first attempt. I asked whether I might request an audience with Elder Thuvan Mar, a name I had heard mentioned more than once by researchers senior to me, always in the same hushed tone reserved for someone who had seen more than the rest of us combined. Elder Mar, I had learned, was one of the last surviving members of the council, who remembered the earliest centuries of the Accords, back when the system was still young enough that its outcomes were not yet guaranteed. Director Kor's expression shifted slightly when I asked, something close to sympathy crossing her face, before it settled back into its usual composure. She told me that elders of that standing did not grant audiences to junior analysts over what remained, in the end, an unproven pattern in old documents. She said she would raise the matter herself if the situation changed. I understood, without her needing to say it more plainly, that she considered the matter closed for now, and that raising it again myself would cost me more standing than it was worth. I want to be honest about what I did next, because it was not brave in any way that would satisfy a story told for its own sake. I did not defy her. I did not go around her. I went back to my desk, and I kept working, quietly, on my own time, compiling everything I had found into a single formal memo, the kind that exists mostly to prove later that someone said something before it happened, rather than to change anything in the moment it was written. I titled it, plainly, A Note on Historical Patterns of Resistance Among Terran Populations, and I filed it through the ordinary channel, knowing it would likely sit unread in an archive of 1,000 other memos nobody had time to open. The pattern itself, once I laid it out in full, was harder to dismiss than any single piece of it had been on its own. I found records from every part of their history I could access, spread across centuries, involving groups that shared no language, no government, no common culture with one another, and in every case that matched the shape I was looking for, the same basic outcome repeated itself. When a group faced a demand for total submission, backed by a threat of destruction if they refused, they overwhelmingly chose to refuse it anyway, even when every reasonable calculation suggested submission would cost them less. Compliance, when it happened at all, tended to come only after every other option had been physically removed, not as a first response to pressure, but as the very last one, arrived at only when resistance had become genuinely impossible rather than merely costly. I remember writing, in that memo, a single line I did not fully understand the weight of until much later. I wrote that every species the Council had previously encountered treated survival as the highest value to protect, which was why the Accords worked so reliably on all of them. I wrote that the Terran record suggested a population that did not share this ordering, one that appeared, again and again, willing to place something else above survival when the two came into direct conflict. I did not know, when I wrote it, what that something else might be. I only knew that I could not find a single clean counterexample anywhere in the archive, and that a pattern with no counterexample was not a coincidence. It was a rule. I spent one long evening trying to work out why the pattern existed at all, though I want to be honest, that I never reached an answer that satisfied me completely. Every other species we had cataloged seemed to organize itself, at the deepest level, around the protection of its own continued existence, which made the Accords simple to apply, since a threat to survival was always the most persuasive argument available to us. The Terran record suggested something stranger, a population that repeatedly ranked certain ideas, certain loyalties, certain private convictions about how life ought to be lived, above the simple fact of remaining alive to live it. I did not know what to call a value system built that way. I only knew that it made them almost impossible to threaten in the manner the Accords were designed for, because the entire design assumed a species would always, eventually, choose survival over principle if the threat was made severe enough. I tried, in the days that followed, to test the pattern against every other species in our records with any comparable history of internal conflict prior to joining the Accords, curious whether I was simply noticing something common to young, divided civilizations everywhere, rather than something unique to the Terrans specifically. I found traces of similar defiance scattered here and there, isolated incidents easily explained away as exceptions rather than patterns. I did not find, in any other species' history, anything resembling the consistency of the Terran record, case after case across centuries, refusing to break in the specific way our models assumed every civilization eventually broke. Whatever this was, it did not appear to be a common feature of young, quarrelsome peoples in general. It appeared to be something closer to a defining trait of this particular one. I recorded the comparison carefully in my memo, aware even as I wrote it that a claim this specific would draw exactly the kind of scrutiny Director Core had already warned me against inviting. I included it anyway. It seemed to me like precisely the kind of detail a careful reader would need in order to understand why the Terran file deserved more caution than the standard procedure assumed it required. The mood elsewhere in the office, during those same weeks, could not have been further from my own. The waiting period had become something close to entertainment for staff who had no direct stake in the outcome. I overheard wagers being placed in the break areas, small and half-serious, about which day the Terran surrender would arrive, and what shape their pleading would take when it did. Some guessed the compact would ask for reduced numbers in the yearly levy. Others guessed they would offer additional resources in exchange for a smaller technology transfer, since they had so little of value to transfer in the first place. Nobody guessed what actually happened, because nobody considered it a possible outcome worth including in the game at all. A fellow junior analyst named Torin Vask, who sat near me in the main pool, and had put in a modest wager of his own, asked one afternoon which outcome I favored, since I had become the resident expert on the file by then, whether I wanted the title or not. I told him honestly that I did not think any of the listed outcomes would happen. He laughed, assuming I was simply refusing to play along out of some junior analyst's sense of caution, and told me that whatever the Terrans said, it would still amount to the same thing in the end, since every species eventually agreed to the same terms, regardless of how they dressed up their surrender. I did not argue with him. I had learned by then that arguing rarely changed anyone's mind before the evidence arrived to change it for them. I did not join the wagers, and my refusal earned me a certain gentle teasing from colleagues who assumed my seriousness came from nothing more than a junior analyst taking her first major assignment too much to heart. Vesa Oren, who had shared my unease from the very beginning, did not tease me, but she also stopped, somewhere around the 20th day, offering me the small nods of agreement she had given so freely at the start. When I asked her about it directly, she told me, gently, that she had begun to worry less about what the Terrans might do, and more about what might happen to my own career if my memo found its way in front of the wrong person, before anything happened to justify it. I understood her concern. I did not stop writing. In the final week before the deadline, I took the one additional step available to someone at my level. I attached a short summary of my memo to the formal agenda notes being prepared for whichever session would eventually review the Terran response, a routine administrative action that required no special approval, since junior staff were permitted to append supporting materials to any file they had contributed research toward. I did not expect it to be read closely, if it was read at all. I only wanted it to exist somewhere official, attached to the file itself, so that whatever happened next, no one could later claim that every warning sign had gone completely unrecorded. On the 25th day, a third piece of information reached my desk, this one small enough that it might easily have been missed entirely if I had not already been watching for exactly this kind of thing. A single automated relay station, positioned to monitor general traffic patterns near several systems bordering Terran space, recorded a brief encrypted transmission passing through its range, far too structured to be background noise, far too short to be decoded by any method available to us. The transmission did not originate from any registered vessel. It did not repeat. Within a day, it was filed under the same category as the drone and the listening post. Unexplained. Likely natural. No further action required. I stopped believing in coincidence somewhere around that third report, sitting alone at my desk, long after the rest of the office had gone quiet for the evening. 3 separate incidents, in 3 different locations, each one bordering the very system whose tribute order response was due in 5 more days. I did not know what the incidents meant. I only knew, with a certainty I could not have explained to Director Core in any language she would have accepted as evidence, that they were not separate at all. They were pieces of a single pattern, the same way the historical records had been pieces of a single pattern, and I was watching that pattern draw closer to something I still could not name. The final days of the waiting period passed more slowly than any other stretch of time I can remember living through. I found myself checking the countdown clock in the main chamber more often than my duties required, watching the number of remaining days fall from 5 to 4 to 3, each one arriving with the same strange mixture of dread and disbelief. Envoy Kell remained confident throughout, telling anyone who asked that the Terran response, when it finally came, would be lengthy, detailed, and full of the careful diplomatic language every species eventually learned to use when begging for better terms than the ones they had been given. He was, in his own way, looking forward to it, the same way a person looks forward to a familiar story they have heard told correctly 100 times before. In the final days, the main chamber began preparing for what everyone else assumed would be a straightforward procedural session. Seating was arranged for observers from allied offices, curious to witness the Terran response firsthand. A translation team was assigned to prepare for what Envoy Kell assured them would likely be a lengthy document, requiring careful, sensitive handling, given how emotional these responses could become once a species finally understood what waited on the other side of refusal. I watched the preparations from the back of the chamber, thinking that everyone around me was setting a table for a meal that had not yet been decided, confident in a menu that no one on the other side of the table had actually agreed to serve. I did not share his anticipation. I had spent 30 days reading everything I could find about a people who apparently did not know how to surrender properly, and I had watched 3 separate signals go quiet along the very border they occupied, and none of it told me what would arrive on the final day. It only told me that whatever arrived, it would not be the familiar story Envoy Kell was expecting to hear. On the morning of the 30th day, exactly at the hour marked in the original order, as the close of the response window, a single transmission reached the outer relay station nearest Terran space, addressed formally to the full council chamber rather than to any individual office. I was not supposed to see it before the official channels processed it and prepared it for proper presentation. I saw it anyway, a bare header flashing across a shared monitoring screen in the analyst pool where I happened to be sitting when the alert came through. Gone again, before anyone thought to question why a junior analyst had been looking at a screen meant for someone several ranks above her. I did not know yet what the message said. I only knew, watching that header disappear, that 30 days of careful, deliberate silence were about to end, and that whatever broke that silence was going to matter more than anything Envoy Kell, or Director Core, or the entire wagering pool in the break room, had prepared themselves to hear. The translation software took only 4 seconds to resolve the message, and in those 4 seconds, I heard the entire chamber stop breathing at once. I was seated in the observation gallery that day, 3 levels above the main floor, close enough to see the delegates, but far enough that none of them could see me watching. The chamber had filled to capacity that morning, every seat taken, extra staff crowded along the back walls, all of them expecting the same thing Envoy Kell had promised for weeks. A long document, full of careful phrasing and desperate diplomacy, the kind every species eventually produced, once the true weight of the accord settled onto their shoulders. The translation team sat ready at the center console, prepared for a session that might run long into the following day, if the Terran response proved as detailed as everyone assumed it would be. I remember the particular energy of that morning, something close to festivity, in how the senior delegates greeted one another before the session began, exchanging the kind of pleasantries reserved for occasions everyone expects to end well. A delegate from a species called the Meren, seated near the front, joked loudly enough for much of the gallery to hear that she hoped the Terran response would at least be entertaining, since she had sat through 8 sessions like this one in her career, and found most of them thoroughly dull. Several people around her laughed. I did not laugh. I had spent the previous night rereading my own memo from beginning to end, and something about the certainty in that laughter had already begun to feel wrong to me, in a way I could not yet justify to anyone who asked. The message arrived exactly on schedule, a single compressed file, properly sealed, addressed to the full council rather than to any one office. I watched the technician at the console open it, watched the translation begin its work, watched the counter beside the display tick upward 1 number at a time, as the software processed a file that, based on its size alone, could not have contained more than a handful of words. 4 seconds later, a single line appeared on the main display, large enough for every delegate in the chamber to read without assistance. Denied. Nothing followed it. No greeting. No explanation. No counter-proposal. No request for modified terms. No plea for mercy dressed up in formal language the way every other species had always offered. Even in refusal, some kind of alternative to consider. Just the one word, sitting alone on a screen, built to display documents that usually ran for pages. The laughter started almost immediately, scattered at first, then spreading as delegates turned to one another, certain they had all just witnessed some kind of error. Someone near the front floor called out that the translation must have failed, that no species facing what the Terrans faced would respond to a tribute order with a single word, and nothing else. Envoy Kell, seated among the senior delegates, laughed along with the rest of them, already composing, I could tell from his expression, the story he intended to tell afterward about the confused opening moments before the real response finally arrived. A delegate 2 seats down from him suggested loudly that the file had likely been corrupted somewhere during transmission, and that we should simply request the Terrans resend their complete response through a secondary channel. Another proposed that the single word might be a formal acknowledgement of receipt, a kind of placeholder before the true document arrived under separate cover, a theory that gained enough traction in the murmuring crowd that several delegates nodded along with it as though it had already been confirmed true. I found myself hoping, in that strange suspended moment, that one of these explanations would prove correct, that some technical fault truly had swallowed pages of careful Terran diplomacy before it ever reached us. I did not want to be right. I have rarely wanted anything as much, in my professional life, as I wanted to be wrong in that particular moment, watching a room full of confident people slowly discover they had no comfortable explanation left to reach for. The presiding officer called for verification, a standard request whenever a translation produced a result that seemed inconsistent with expectation. The technician at the console requested a retransmission through the proper diplomatic channel, a formal process that usually took hours to complete, since it required confirming the request through several layers of protocol before the other party could respond. Those 11 minutes felt considerably longer than any 11 minutes I had experienced before, or have experienced since. The chamber did not empty, though several delegates drifted toward the refreshment areas along the back wall, still speaking in the same easy tones they had used before the message arrived, though I noticed their conversations growing shorter, their glances back toward the display growing more frequent. Somewhere in the gallery behind me, I heard a junior aide ask her supervisor, only half joking, what the procedure was if a diplomatic reply genuinely turned out to be a single hostile word and nothing else. The supervisor told her, with a confidence I suspect he no longer felt by the time he finished the sentence, that no procedure existed for that outcome, because no species had ever been foolish enough to attempt it. The Terran reply came back within 11 minutes. I remember the number precisely because I counted every one of those minutes myself, watching the chamber's mood shift slowly from amused to uncertain as the silence stretched longer than anyone had expected a simple confirmation to take. When the response finally arrived, it came bearing a full diplomatic seal, the exact formal authentication our own protocols required for a binding communication, applied with a precision that matched, syllable for syllable, mark for mark, the same fluency Owen Hale had shown in that first meeting months earlier. The word had not changed, denied, sealed now in a way that left no possible reading beyond intentional and complete refusal, offered once, understood to require no repetition, no elaboration, and apparently, no further discussion of any kind. The laughter stopped. I have tried many times since to describe exactly what changed in that chamber during the silence that followed, and I am still not certain I have ever gotten it entirely right. It was not panic, not yet. It was something quieter and, in its own way, more unsettling. The particular silence of a great many people, realizing at the same moment that they had walked into a room, assuming they understood every possible outcome, only to discover an outcome sitting in front of them that nobody had thought worth preparing for. I watched the younger delegates first, the ones closest to my own age, still uncertain how to react, glancing at their neighbors for some cue about what the correct response should be. Several of them were still smiling faintly, waiting for someone to explain the joke, unwilling to fully accept that there was no joke to explain. Then I found Elder Thuvan Mar. I had never seen her in person before that day, though I had heard her name spoken with a particular kind of reverence by researchers senior to me, the tone reserved for someone who had witnessed the earliest, least settled years of the Accords, back when the system's outcomes were not yet the foregone conclusion they had become by the time I entered the office. She sat near the center of the senior delegation, small and still, in a way that made the restless motion of everyone around her seem almost frantic by comparison. When the word appeared the second time, sealed and unmistakable, I watched her go paler than I had thought her kind capable of going, a color draining from the ridged plating along her jaw, that I had only ever seen described in old medical texts as a response to genuine deep alarm. She did not speak. She did not need to. Several senior delegates near her had clearly been watching for her reaction, as closely as I had, and when they saw it, whatever confidence remained in that section of the chamber left along with the color in her face. I understood, watching her, that I was looking at the difference between people who had only ever read about the earliest years of the Accords, and someone who had actually lived through whatever memory that single word had just called back up in her. I did not know yet what that memory was. I only knew that it frightened her more than anything I had personally witnessed in my short career, and that her fear meant more to the room than the confusion of 100 younger delegates combined. Later, much later, I would learn a small piece of why her reaction ran so much deeper than anyone else's in that chamber, though even then, the full picture remained locked away in records I never gained clearance to read completely. What I learned was only this. Elder Mar had sat in a much smaller chamber, centuries earlier, during one of the last occasions that single word had ever needed to be spoken aloud in a council session at all. She had been young then, barely more than an aide herself, and whatever she witnessed in the time that followed had shaped the entire remainder of her long career into something cautious, in a way her colleagues had always found slightly excessive, slightly old-fashioned. A caution, I now understood, that had cost her nothing at all, in comparison to whatever it must have cost someone else. The presiding officer, perhaps sensing the shift in the chamber and wanting some way to regain control of it, ordered a formal request for clarification to be sent back to the Terran Compact, asking whether the response represented a final position or an opening position within continued negotiation. A standard diplomatic question that almost every species, even in their angriest refusals, had always answered with at least some acknowledgement of continued conversation. That request went out within the hour. I watched the chamber wait for a reply through the rest of that day, and then through the night that followed, since the chamber never fully closed once a live diplomatic exchange was underway. No reply came. Not a refusal. Not a repetition of the same word. Nothing at all. A silence that felt, after the single loud clarity of denied, somehow louder than the word itself had been. I have come to think, since then, that the silence was its own kind of message, perhaps the clearest one the Terrans sent us in that entire exchange. They had said everything they intended to say. Anything further we wanted to know, we would apparently need to learn some other way. Some delegates treated the silence as an opportunity, arguing that a Terran refusal to engage further meant the response should simply be disregarded as procedurally incomplete, allowing the council to proceed as though no answer had been received at all. Others argued the opposite, that the silence carried its own full legal weight under the Accords, a completed and binding refusal requiring an entirely different category of response than anything the existing procedures had ever been written to address. I listened to both arguments made with equal confidence by delegates who, 3 days earlier, would have agreed with each other about almost everything. It was, I think, the first small crack in the idea that the Accords could simply absorb whatever came, the way Director Kor had once assured me they always had before. Director Kor found me in the observation gallery sometime after midnight, still sitting in the same seat I had claimed that morning, unable to make myself leave. She did not say very much. She looked at the empty display, still showing the same single word it had shown for hours, and then she looked at me, and she said quietly that she wished she had listened more carefully to my memo. I did not feel the satisfaction I might once have imagined feeling in that moment. I only felt tired and afraid, in a way that made the small vindication of being right feel almost beside the point. We sat together in that gallery for a while, neither of us speaking, watching the single word continue to glow on a display built for documents 10,000 times its length. I found myself thinking, absurdly, of the Auvergne platform again, the quiet lines, the small bags of belongings, the families taught not to cry in public. I wondered whether somewhere on that small blue world, families were standing in lines of their own right now, waiting to learn what their one word had cost them. I did not yet understand that the question itself revealed exactly how little I still understood about what I was watching unfold. I asked her what she thought would happen next. She told me, honestly, that she did not know, and that not knowing frightened her far more than any answer would have, even a terrible one. At least a terrible answer would have given the council something concrete to plan against. A single word, offered once and never explained, gave us nothing but the certainty that whatever came next, it would not follow any pattern we had prepared for. By the following morning, word of the response had spread through every level of the council, well beyond the analysts and delegates who had witnessed it directly. I heard it discussed in hushed voices in every corridor I walked through, always the same question repeated in slightly different words. What kind of species answers an extinction-level threat with a single syllable and nothing more? I did not have an answer for them either, though I suspected, from everything I had read across 30 days of increasingly sleepless research, that the honest answer was simpler and far more frightening than anyone in that chamber was ready to hear. It was not that the Terrans had nothing more to say. It was that they had already decided, long before the deadline arrived, that nothing more needed saying, and that the deciding itself had happened somewhere we could not see, in a place our surveys and our drones and our listening posts had never quite been able to reach. The presiding officer called for an emergency session before the second day ended, the kind of session reserved, according to the rules I had memorized during my earliest training, for exactly 3 categories of crisis in the entire history of the Accords. I had never expected to witness one in my lifetime. I certainly had never expected to be summoned to attend one myself, which was precisely the message waiting for me when I finally returned to my own quarters that morning, exhausted, unwashed, and far more afraid than I had any practice being. I was to appear before the full emergency session within the day, to present, in person, everything contained in the memo that had sat unread for weeks, in an archive nobody had time to open. I sat with that summons in my hands for a long while before I could make myself move, understanding, in a way I had not quite let myself understand before that moment, that the pattern I had found was no longer a private theory I could set aside if it proved inconvenient. It had become, in the space of one sealed word, the single most urgent question the entire council needed answered, and I was the only person in the room who had spent 30 days trying to answer it. I thought, sitting there with the summons still warm from its transmission, of every moment across those 30 days when I might have pushed harder, argued louder, insisted on being heard by someone with the authority to act, before a single sealed word made the question impossible to avoid any longer. I did not know, in that moment, whether earlier warning would have changed anything at all. Some part of me suspected it would not have. The council I served had built an entire 1,000 years of certainty on the assumption that every species eventually bent to the same pressure, and a memo from a junior analyst, however carefully researched, was never going to dismantle 1,000 years of certainty on its own. It had taken a single sealed word instead, arriving exactly on schedule, precise and complete and utterly without explanation, to accomplish in 4 seconds what 30 days of careful research had failed to accomplish at all. I dressed for the emergency session with hands that would not quite stop shaking, and told myself, without much success, that I was ready to say in front of the full council everything I had only ever said before, to a memo nobody read, a colleague who worried more about my career than my conclusions, and a director who now wished, too late to matter, that she had listened. The emergency chamber convenes for only 3 categories of crisis in the entire history of the Accords, a fact I had memorized during my earliest training without ever expecting to witness one firsthand. A direct attack on council territory, a total breakdown of order within a member species severe enough to threaten neighboring worlds, and a formal, confirmed refusal of the Accords by any species under evaluation. I had always assumed, reciting that list as a student, that the third category existed mostly as a formality, a rule written down because thoroughness demanded it rather than because anyone expected to use it. I stood outside the smaller, older chamber reserved for emergency sessions, waiting to be called, and understood that I was about to become the first person in 900 years to explain the third category to a room full of delegates who had never needed to think about it seriously before that week. Vesa found me there in the final minutes before the doors opened, having talked her way past 2 junior clerks to reach the waiting area at all. She did not offer me false comfort, which I was grateful for, since I do not think I could have tolerated it in that moment. She told me only that she had read my full memo twice more since the response arrived, and that she believed every word of it now, whatever that belief was worth to a chamber about to make its decision without her vote in it. She squeezed my hand once, briefly, in the manner our people used for encouragement rather than affection, and told me to say exactly what I had written, without softening any of it for the comfort of the delegates listening. The chamber itself felt different from the main hall where I had watched the response arrive. Smaller, older, built from a darker stone that our records claimed predated the Accords themselves, meant to hold only the delegates whose worlds carried enough standing to vote on matters of true crisis. Elder Thuvan Mar sat near the front, still pale, though composed now in the careful way I imagined she had trained herself to appear composed across many centuries of practice. Administrator Corvath Ian sat several seats away from her, upright, restless, radiating the particular energy of a man who intended to be the loudest voice in the room before the session ended. I was called to the small speaking platform near the center of the chamber, sooner than I expected, given almost no time to settle myself before every eye in the room turned toward me at once. I remember gripping the edge of the platform harder than necessary, and I remember the presiding officer telling me, not unkindly, that I should simply present my findings as plainly as I had written them, since the chamber had already read the memo attached to the file and wanted to hear the reasoning behind it directly from me. I told them what I had found. I explained the pattern across centuries of unrelated Terran history, the near-total absence of surrender in the face of existential threat, the way compliance only ever arrived after resistance became physically impossible rather than merely costly. I explained the strange fluency the Compact's liaison had shown with our own legal language in his very first meeting, and the 3 unexplained incidents along the Terran border in the weeks leading up to the deadline, incidents our own senior technicians had been unable to fully dismiss as natural phenomena, no matter how badly some of them wanted to. Then I offered the thesis I had turned over so many times in my own mind that I could recite it now without hesitation, though my voice shook regardless. I told the chamber that the Terrans did not appear to treat refusal as an opening move in a negotiation, the way every other species we had catalogued eventually did. I told them that the historical record suggested refusal, for this species, functioned as a final answer, offered once and meant completely, and that any response we made in turn would very likely be read by the Terrans not as a negotiating tactic, but as an equally final answer of our own, one they would treat exactly as seriously as we intended any answer of ours to be treated. I said, as clearly as I could manage, that a demonstration of force intended to frighten the Compact into compliance carried a real risk of being received not as a warning, but as the beginning of exactly the kind of conflict their own history suggested they were most willing to fight, to its absolute end. A delegate I did not recognize, seated among the mid-ranking worlds toward the back of the chamber, asked whether my research offered any evidence at all that the Terrans possessed the capability to act on such willingness, given how plainly the original survey had rated their technology. It was a fair question, and I did not have a comfortable answer for it. I told him honestly that capability and willingness were different measurements, and that our survey had only ever assessed the first of the two. I told him that a species willing to fight past the point where fighting made any rational sense was, in my reading of their history, far more dangerous per unit of actual strength than a species that surrendered the moment resistance became merely inconvenient. He did not look satisfied by my answer. I was not entirely satisfied by it myself. The silence that followed my testimony did not last as long as I had hoped it would. Administrator Ian rose first, and I understood immediately, watching him take the floor, that whatever fear the sealed word had caused him privately, he had already converted that fear into something louder and more familiar to him. He reminded the chamber that I was the same junior analyst who had raised concerns about a broken sensor drone months earlier, concerns that had, in his words, amounted to nothing at the time, and amounted to very little more now, dressed up in more elaborate language. He said that my research, however thorough, described a species behaving exactly as any primitive culture behaves, when it does not yet understand the true scale of the power arrayed against it. Fear, he said, made species defiant right up until the moment fear was given a proper target to focus on. A demonstration was not a risk in his reading of the situation. It was simply the missing piece that would finally give the Terrans something concrete enough to be afraid of. He turned to address me directly at one point, his tone almost gentle, in a way that felt more unsettling than open hostility would have. He told me that he understood why a young analyst, having spent 30 days immersed in old records of conflict and loss, might come to see danger everywhere she looked, and that this was, in his experience, a common and forgivable mistake among researchers early in their careers. He said the chamber owed me its thanks for diligence, not its agreement, and that the two were not the same thing, no matter how much effort had gone into producing the first. Several delegates murmured approval at that distinction. I said nothing further, because I understood that anything I added at that point would only be read as the very defensiveness he had just predicted from me. He was not alone in that view. Several delegates spoke after him, echoing variations of the same argument, and I began to understand, listening to them, that their real concern ran deeper than the Terrans themselves. One delegate, representing a species that had joined the Accords only 2 centuries earlier, said plainly what several others seemed to be circling without quite saying aloud. If word spread across 1,000 member worlds that a single new species had refused the Accords and suffered no visible consequence for it, every reluctant member currently paying tribute under some private resentment of their own might begin asking questions the Council had spent 9 centuries training them never to ask. The true danger, in this view, was not a war with the Terrans. It was the example a war avoided might set for everyone else who was watching. Another delegate, from a species that had provided tribute under the Accords for longer than any world besides my own, added that she had spent decades administering the yearly levy from her own people, and had grown quietly used to the small acts of private grief that accompanied every departure, grief her government had long ago stopped trying to fully suppress. She said that grief was manageable, generation after generation, only because her people had never once been given a visible reason to believe resistance might succeed. She said she did not relish what a demonstration might cost the Terrans. She said she relished even less what an unanswered refusal might eventually cost everyone else, still quietly complying, once word of it traveled far enough. Elder Thuvan Mar spoke last among the senior delegates, and the chamber quieted for her, in a way it had not quieted for anyone before her. She said that she had lived through the last occasion this chamber had needed to invoke its 3rd category of crisis, long before most of the delegates present had been born, and that she remembered, more clearly than she wished to, how a demonstration meant to frighten a defiant species into compliance had instead confirmed every fear that species already held about us. She did not describe what had happened afterward in any detail. She said only that the cost had been higher than anyone anticipated beforehand, and that she had spent every year since hoping the chamber would never need to make that particular choice again. She proposed an alternative. Delay the fleet, send instead a smaller diplomatic mission, unarmed, prepared to ask the Terrans directly what conditions, if any, might open a path to renegotiation. She acknowledged that this approach offered no guarantee of success. She argued that it offered something the fleet could not, which was information, gathered without foreclosing any option the Council might still wish to choose once that information was in hand. She addressed Administrator Ian directly near the end of her remarks, something I do not believe I saw her do for any other delegate that day. She told him that she had once stood exactly where he now stood, certain that a show of strength would resolve a fear she did not yet fully understand, and that she had been wrong in a way she had spent every subsequent year of her long career trying quietly to prevent from happening again. She did not ask him to trust her memory over his own confidence. She only asked him to consider that confidence and correctness had never reliably been the same thing, in her experience, and that the chamber was about to gamble something far larger than either of their careers on the difference between them. The vote, when it finally came, was not close. I do not know whether that troubles me more or less than a narrow vote would have. A narrow vote might have suggested the chamber understood the weight of what it was choosing. Instead, the fear that Elder Mar's testimony had raised in some delegates was outweighed, decisively, by the fear Administrator Ian had raised in far more of them. The fear of what 1,000 watching worlds might conclude if the Council appeared to hesitate. The correction fleet was approved before the session ended, framed carefully, in the language of the final resolution, as a demonstration rather than an invasion. Ships would muster at a secure position within reach of Terran space, sufficient in number to make the Council's continued strength unmistakable, but under strict orders to avoid direct engagement, unless first provoked. The stated purpose was persuasion, not destruction. I want to record that clearly, because I do not believe the delegates who voted for it that day intended what very nearly happened afterward. I believe they intended exactly what the resolution said, a demonstration, a reminder, nothing more. I watched Elder Mar during the final count, and I noticed that she did not look angry at the outcome, only tired, in the particular way I imagine a person looks after watching history repeat a mistake they had hoped, against all their experience, might have finally been learned from. She left the chamber before the session formally closed, walking slowly past the platform where I still stood, and paused just long enough to tell me, quietly, that I had done exactly what should have been done, and that the chamber's decision was not a reflection of anything I had failed to make clear. I did not find as much comfort in that as I wanted to. Fleet Marshal Draith Cole, who would command the assembled ships, was summoned into the chamber near the end of the session to receive his orders directly. I had not met him before that day. He carried himself the way I imagine Administrator Ian must have carried himself decades earlier, before age settled some of the restlessness out of him, certain of his own capability, in a way that made questioning him feel, even to delegates who outranked him, faintly embarrassing to attempt. He accepted his orders with visible satisfaction, and said, before he left the chamber, that he looked forward to teaching the Terrans the same lesson every other reluctant species had eventually learned. Someone asked him, as a formality more than a genuine question, whether he had reviewed the historical analysis presented earlier in the session. He said he had heard the summary, and that he respected the effort behind it, but that he had commanded fleets during 11 separate demonstrations across his career, and that every single species on the receiving end of one had eventually reached the same conclusion once the scale of what faced them became impossible to ignore any longer. He did not say this unkindly. He said it the way a person states a fact they consider too well established to require further discussion, and I understood, watching him leave the chamber with the same easy confidence he had entered it with, that nothing I or anyone else had said that day had changed his expectations for what was about to happen even slightly. A separate, quieter argument unfolded near the close of the session, over whether the compact should be formally notified of the fleet's approach before its arrival, or allowed to discover the demonstration only once it was already assembled. Administrator Ian argued forcefully for surprise, insisting that advance notice would only give the Terrans time to prepare some response we could not yet anticipate. Elder Mar argued, with less energy than she had shown earlier but no less conviction, that notifying them in advance was the only remaining gesture of good faith the Council had left to offer, and that ambushing a species we had already accused of dangerous unpredictability seemed unlikely to calm anything at all. The chamber voted, in the end, to send formal notice of the fleet's movement through the same diplomatic channel Owen Hale had used to receive the original order, a small concession to Elder Mar's position that changed nothing about the fleet's mission, but that I have often wondered about since. The Terrans, it turned out, had known exactly where our fleet would gather, and precisely when, for the entire span of its assembly. I do not know whether that notice was the reason the absolution found us so easily, or whether it would have found us regardless. I have never been able to decide which possibility troubles me more. I was not consulted on the fleet's composition or its orders, which did not surprise me. What did surprise me was the assignment handed to me at the very end of the session, delivered by Director Core with an expression I could not quite read. I was to be attached to the fleet as an integration analyst, tasked with preparing the paperwork that would be needed once the Terrans, following the demonstration, finally agreed to comply with the original tribute order. It was, I understood even as she explained it to me, a kind of quiet punishment, disguised as an assignment, a way of placing me close enough to witness the Council being proven right, in case anyone still needed convincing after everything I had said. I did not argue against the assignment. Some part of me, exhausted after weeks of being right about things nobody wanted to hear, almost hoped it would prove me wrong instead. I packed for the journey that same night, and found myself, for the first time since the drone had first gone silent all those months earlier, wishing more than anything else that I truly had been imagining things all along. I had not been imagining things. I understood that fully only a few days later, watching from a support vessel at the edge of the muster point, as Fleet Marshal Draith Cole's confident, well-ordered fleet met something none of our preparations had accounted for at all. The correction fleet had been in position for 6 hours when the alarms went off for a ship that was not supposed to exist in that part of space. I was aboard a support vessel near the rear of the formation, 3 decks below the observation deck where most of the analytical staff had gathered to watch the muster point fill with ships over the preceding days. Fleet Marshal Draith Cole had assembled a formation large enough to be visible from the Terran system, with unaided instruments, exactly as the resolution had intended, a wall of hulls, meant to communicate strength, before a single word needed to be exchanged. I remember thinking, watching the formation complete itself from my small viewport, that it was an impressive sight in the way a mountain is impressive, solid and permanent, and entirely unaware of anything that might eventually prove larger than itself. The mood among the crews during those 6 hours of waiting had been almost celebratory. Message traffic between vessels full of the easy confidence that comes from being part of an overwhelming show of force, rather than the uncertain side of one. I heard, relayed through the general channel, at least 3 separate officers wagering on how quickly the Terran Compact would issue a formal apology, once word of our formation reached them. The same kind of wagering I had watched consume the office during the original 30-day wait, dressed up now in slightly more serious language, because it involved warships instead of documents. The alarm did not begin as an alarm about an incoming vessel. It began as confusion, several sensor stations reporting contradictory readings within seconds of one another, each insisting that a ship of considerable size had appeared inside the formation itself, not approaching from any direction our screening vessels monitored, but simply present, as though it had always been there, and our instruments were only now catching up to a fact that had been true for some time. I have read the technical reports many times since, prepared by officers with far more expertise than I possess in sensor architecture and detection theory, and none of them have ever fully explained how a single vessel crossed a screening perimeter, designed and layered by some of the Council's most capable engineers, without triggering a single warning before it was already sitting among us. The most honest of those reports simply states that our detection network operated exactly as designed, and that the vessel in question had simply not been detectable by it, a conclusion that satisfied no one who read it, myself included. Fleet Marshal Draith Cole's voice came over the general channel within minutes, calm at first, ordering full identification scans on the intruding vessel, and demanding to know how sensor crews had allowed a ship of that size to go unnoticed during approach. The answer that came back, relayed a moment later to every vessel in the fleet, was the one nobody had an adequate response to. There had been no approach detected. There had only been absence, and then presence, with nothing observable in between. I remember gripping the edge of my console hard enough that the material left an impression along my palm lasting well into the following day, listening to officers far more experienced than myself struggle to describe a phenomenon their training had never once prepared them to categorize. One sensor technician, her voice tight with the particular strain of someone trying very hard to sound calmer than she felt, suggested that the vessel might have been present in some passive, powered-down state, since before our own fleet arrived, invisible simply because nothing about it had been active enough to detect. Another technician pointed out, not unkindly, that this explanation required us to believe an entire warship had sat silently inside our chosen muster point for days, without any of us noticing, waiting for a moment of its own choosing to reveal itself. Neither explanation felt more comfortable than the other. Both, I understood even then, amounted to the same underlying fact. Something had been watching us long before we had any idea we were being watched. The identification scans, once completed, returned a single designation drawn from markings visible along the vessel's hull, rendered by our translation systems as close as they could manage to the original Terran characters. Absolution. I did not know, in that moment, whether the name had been chosen for its meaning, or simply as a designation, with no particular significance behind it. I have since come to believe it was chosen very deliberately indeed, though I could not have told you why with any confidence until much later. The absolution did not hail us. It did not move, beyond the small, steady corrections any vessel makes to hold its position. It simply sat among the assembled fleet, radiating an amount of contained power our own sensors struggled to fully quantify, the readings climbing and adjusting, as though our instruments themselves were uncertain how to categorize what they were measuring. I remember a technician's voice on the general channel, not addressed to anyone in particular, simply thinking aloud in the way people do under sufficient strain, saying that the vessel's output curves did not resemble anything in our current classification system, and that whoever had built it had apparently not felt any need to make it resemble anything we would recognize. Fleet Marshal Draith Cole ordered repeated hails on every standard frequency, then on several non-standard ones, requesting identification and stated intent from the vessel now sitting inside a formation it had no recorded permission to enter. The absolution did not respond to any of them. I have wondered since whether that silence was itself a kind of answer, the same silence the Council had received after requesting clarification on the sealed word weeks earlier, a silence that meant, as clearly as language could have, that nothing further needed explaining to us until we had first demonstrated we understood what had already been said. I do not know exactly what passed through Fleet Marshal Cole's mind in the minutes that followed, since I was never granted access to his private communications from that day. Only the general channel every vessel in the fleet could hear. What I do know is that he ordered a single warning shot fired across the Absolution's bow, a standard demonstration used throughout Council history to communicate seriousness without initiating true engagement, intended, in every previous case I had ever studied, to produce an immediate and cooperative response from whatever vessel received it. The shot was fired. I felt the recoil of it through the deck plating of my own vessel, several ships away from the one that had actually fired, the whole formation moving slightly in sympathetic response, the way a held breath moves an entire body. The Absolution did not fire back. What happened instead took less than 4 seconds by the official record, though I have never been able to experience it, even in memory, as anything shorter than several long minutes. A wave of something moved outward from the Absolution's position, not visible in the way weapons fire is visible, but felt, throughout every vessel in that formation including my own, as a sudden and complete absence of power. Lights failed first, replaced within a breath by the dim emergency glow every Council vessel carried for exactly this kind of failure. Engines went silent, not with the violence of destruction, but with the simple, total stillness of something switched off rather than broken. I felt my own vessel's gravity generation falter for one sickening moment, before stabilizing on some final reserve system that had apparently not been included in whatever the Absolution had reached out and touched. Around me, in the sudden dimness, I heard the particular sound of an entire crew compartment full of people trying very hard not to panic, and only partially succeeding. Quick, sharp breaths, a colleague's hand finding the edge of a console to steady herself, someone several seats away repeating a question to no one in particular about whether life support had been affected, a question nobody in that first disoriented moment had the composure to answer. The silence where the engine hum should have been was, in its own way, louder than any alarm I had ever heard sound aboard a vessel before. I want to be as precise as I can about what did not happen in that moment, because I know how easily a story like this one can be told in a way that makes it larger and bloodier than it actually was. No hull was breached. No vessel in that entire formation, including the flagship closest to the Absolution itself, suffered any structural damage at all. No crew member, across the many thousands stationed throughout the fleet that day, was injured in the moments that followed, beyond the ordinary bruises and frightened falls that come from lights failing suddenly aboard a vessel in motion. What the Absolution had done, in less time than it takes to draw a full breath, was disable every offensive and propulsion system across an entire assembled fleet, without so much as scorching a single external plate, and without costing a single life. It was, I have come to believe, the most frightening thing I have ever witnessed, precisely because of how little damage it actually caused. We drifted, all of us, powerless and dark, for what the official logs later recorded as 11 minutes, the same number. I noted later with a chill I did not examine too closely at the time, as the minutes we had waited for the sealed word's confirmation weeks earlier. Communication between vessels continued only through backup systems clearly never expected to carry the full weight of an entire fleet's panic at once, so that what reached me, in fragments, was less a coherent report and more a chorus of voices from a dozen different ships, each describing the same helplessness in slightly different words. A colleague seated near me, an integration aide I knew only well enough to exchange pleasantries with in ordinary times, asked me quietly, during one of the longer stretches of silence between fragmented reports, whether I had known something like this was possible. I told her honestly that I had suspected something was possible, though I had never once pictured anything resembling what had actually happened. She asked why. If I had suspected it, nobody senior enough to matter had done anything to prepare for it. I did not have a good answer for her, beyond the one I had already given myself many times across the preceding months. Suspecting a thing and being believed about it were two entirely different achievements, and I had only ever managed the first of them. Then, on every channel at once, in a transmission our systems received without any request or hail preceding it, the Absolution spoke. It did not offer an explanation. It did not issue a demand or a threat of further action. It repeated, in the same flat, complete form the Council had already received once before, the single word that had started this entire crisis in the first place: denied. Nothing more followed it. No elaboration on what, precisely, was being denied this time, since the fleet had made no formal demand of its own for the absolution to refuse. I understood, hearing it repeated in the darkness of a powerless ship, that the word was no longer answering any single question we had asked. It had become something closer to a standing position, applicable to whatever we might think to try next, delivered once more simply to be certain we had understood it the first time. I sat in the dim emergency light of my own small vessel, surrounded by colleagues too frightened to speak, and understood, more clearly than I had understood anything across the entire strange year that preceded it, exactly what I was looking at. The absolution could have done considerably more than it had done. A vessel capable of disabling an entire fleet's systems that completely, without a single hostile discharge, was a vessel that had chosen its level of response with total deliberation, not one that had reached the limit of its own capability. It had shown us exactly enough to make its point, and had gone to some visible effort to show us nothing more than that. That restraint frightened me far more than destruction would have. Destruction, however terrible, would have told us something we already understood how to categorize, a demonstration of strength answered with strength, an old and familiar shape even in its horror. What the absolution offered instead was proof of a choice, made calmly, by whoever or whatever crewed that vessel, to leave every single one of us alive and unharmed, while making it unmistakably clear that our entire assembled strength had not been sufficient to compel so much as a single additional word from them. A species, or a ship, willing to destroy us would have been frightening in a way our 1,000 years of history had prepared us to understand. A species, willing to spare us completely, while making certain we understood exactly how little our strength had mattered in the moment it counted, was frightening in a way nothing in our history had prepared us for at all. Fleet systems began returning slowly over the following hour, section by section, the same way they had failed, without any of the damage reports that would normally follow an engagement of that scale. By the time full power returned across the formation, the absolution was gone, departed as silently and as impossibly as it had arrived, leaving no trace on any sensor log beyond the readings already recorded during the minutes it had chosen to remain among us. Fleet Marshal Draeth Cole issued the order to withdraw within the hour, a decision that required no debate among his command staff, since every alternative had already been answered before anyone thought to propose it. I did not see him personally during the return journey, though I heard, through the same channels that carried every other piece of fleet gossip, that he had said very little to anyone since giving that order, a silence that struck me as its own kind of confirmation from a man who had entered that formation, certain of exactly how the encounter would end. I did learn, much later, second-hand and through channels I was never able to fully verify, that he submitted his resignation from active fleet command within a season of our return, citing reasons the official record listed only as personal, though I have always suspected the true reason required no further elaboration for anyone who had been aboard that formation with him. I do not know whether to feel sympathy for him or something closer to the same frustration I still feel toward Administrator Ian. Both men had built their confidence on the same assumption, tested 1,000 times before across 1,000 other species, and both had simply been unlucky enough to be standing at the front of the room the first time that assumption finally failed. News of what had happened reached Council space well before our own fleet did. Relay stations along our return path had monitored portions of the exchange in real time, and whatever discipline might once have kept such an event quiet long enough for an official account to be prepared first, had apparently already failed by the time we crossed back into fully settled territory. I heard fragments of the story repeated back to me, second-hand, by staff who had not been present for any of it, each version slightly different, all of them circling the same essential fact that no amount of retelling could soften. An entire correction fleet, assembled specifically to demonstrate the Council's continued strength, had been rendered powerless in under 4 seconds by a single vessel that had then simply repeated the same one word it had already sent us once before, and had left every single one of us alive to carry that word home ourselves. I understood, listening to those fragments multiply across every level of the Council in the days that followed, that we had not merely failed to frighten the Terrans into compliance. We had shown 1,000 watching worlds something considerably more dangerous than our own strength. We had shown them the exact moment our strength stopped being enough, and precisely how little it had cost the other side to prove it. The clerk who typed the new classification into the permanent record did not know a category like it had ever been used before, because it had not. Sovereign, unaligned. 2 words, appearing for the first time in 900 years of council records, replacing the Category 7 designation that had once seemed so obviously correct to a room full of delegates who had laughed at a survey report without reading past its opening pages. The new classification carried no template, no established procedure, because no procedure had ever needed to describe a species that existed entirely outside the Accords, neither client nor open enemy, simply present, acknowledged, and left alone. The tribute order was withdrawn quietly, without ceremony, folded into an administrative correction, rather than announced as the reversal it plainly was. I do not think a single delegate who had voted for the correction fleet ever stood before the full chamber to explain why that fleet's mission had ended the way it did. Some outcomes, I have learned, do not require an explanation so much as a very careful silence around the space where an explanation would otherwise have gone. I learned of the reclassification the same way most of the office did, through a routine update notice buried among dozens of others in my morning correspondence, rather than through any grander announcement befitting what it actually represented. Vesa found the notice before I did, and forwarded it to me with a single line attached, asking whether I had ever imagined, sitting beside her in that first classification meeting so many months earlier, that the file we argued over so briefly would end here. I told her, honestly, that I had imagined a great many endings for that file, during the months in between, and that this was not the one I had feared most, though it was also not one I had thought to hope for. I returned to my ordinary duties in the weeks that followed, though very little about my ordinary duties felt ordinary any longer. Director Core no longer treated my opinions as something to be managed carefully around the edges of a decision already made elsewhere. Administrator Ian, whom I encountered only once more in a corridor rather than a chamber, did not apologize, though he did incline his head slightly, in a gesture I had only ever seen him offer to delegates who outranked him, and said nothing further before walking on. I did not need him to say more than that. I understood what the gesture cost him, and found, to my own surprise, that it was enough. The ripples moved outward from that single word far more quickly than I had expected them to, and in directions the Council had spent 9 centuries specifically designing the Accords to prevent. Within a season, 3 separate member worlds submitted formal requests to renegotiate the terms of their own tribute obligations, citing procedural grounds so technical that I suspected the true motivation had very little to do with the specific arguments presented. Within 2 seasons, a 4th world simply stopped delivering its yearly levy on schedule, offering no formal explanation at all, an act that would have been unthinkable before the correction fleet limped home from Terran space with nothing to show for its strength, except the story of exactly how little that strength had mattered. Director Core told me, during one of our now more candid conversations, that the Council's legal office had quietly begun drafting contingency language for a version of the Accords that assumed compliance could no longer simply be taken for granted from every member indefinitely. I did not ask her how that project was proceeding. I suspected, correctly as it turned out, that it was proceeding very slowly, and with considerably more disagreement than the original Accords had ever required. I processed a portion of that renegotiation correspondence myself, in the months that followed, and found the language used by each petitioning world curiously restrained given the size of what they were actually requesting. None of them mentioned the Terrans directly. None of them needed to. Every petition arrived within the same narrow window of time, citing procedural grounds that varied just enough to avoid looking coordinated, though I do not believe for a moment that the timing was accidental. A delegate from one of the petitioning worlds, an official I dealt with only through formal correspondence and never met in person, wrote a single line in an otherwise unremarkable filing that I copied into my own private notes before the official record was finalized. She wrote that her people had spent generations believing certain questions were simply not survivable to ask aloud, and that they had recently begun to wonder whether that belief had ever been tested as thoroughly as they once assumed. I found myself returning, during this same period, to records of the Ovran platform I had once observed so early in my career, curious whether anything about their own arrangement had shifted in the aftermath of everything that happened. I learned that an Ovran delegation had submitted a quiet inquiry of their own, asking only for clarification on whether their existing agreement remained subject to review under the same procedural grounds other worlds had begun citing. The inquiry had been answered, eventually, with a careful, non-committal response that changed nothing in practice, though I noted that it had been answered at all, where a similar inquiry submitted a decade earlier had simply gone unacknowledged in the archive I searched. I did not know whether to call that progress. I called it, in my own private notes, a beginning, since I had learned by then that beginnings rarely announce themselves as anything more dramatic than a question finally being answered instead of ignored. I want to be careful here not to overstate what changed, because the Accords did not collapse, and the Ovren platform I had once watched with such quiet unease continued sending its own citizens away on schedule for years after everything I have described here took place. The old order did not fall. It simply stopped being certain of itself in the way it had always been certain before, and I have come to believe that uncertainty, patient and quiet and spreading one hesitant world at a time, may prove to matter more in the long span of history than any single dramatic collapse ever could have. I finally returned to the drone that had started all of it for me nearly a year after the correction fleet's withdrawal, once a small portion of the Absolution incident's technical findings had been declassified enough for analysts at my level to review. Buried within a footnote in a report focused entirely on sensor architecture, I found a passing comparison between the emission signature recorded during the Absolution's arrival and an older, fragmentary signature preserved from an entirely different file, my file, the half-second of interference that had ended my listening drone's signal, all those months before any of this began. The match was not certain. The report itself hedged its language carefully, noting only a partial correlation insufficient to draw any firm conclusion. I did not need the report to be certain. I had spent a year studying every available fragment of that original interference, slowed down, sharpened, examined from every angle my limited clearance allowed, and I recognized the shape the moment I saw it sitting beside the newer data. The drone had not failed. It had been silenced, deliberately and precisely, by something that understood exactly how to disable it without leaving behind the kind of wreckage that might have told us clearly what we were dealing with. The listening post that fell silent during the 30-day wait. The brief encrypted transmission near the border that had never repeated. I could not prove, with the evidence available to me, that all three incidents shared a single origin. I no longer needed proof to understand, in the way a person understands the shape of a room, by the sound their own footsteps make inside it, that we had not spent a single day of that entire year unwatched. They had been observing us, I came to believe, for a considerable time, before we ever worked up the confidence to approach them, with an order we assumed they had no choice but to accept. Every quiet failure along their border, every piece of unexplained interference our analysts had dismissed one at a time as coincidence, had very likely been the same patient watchfulness, conducted so carefully that we mistook its evidence for equipment failure rather than intention. We had spent 30 days waiting to learn what the Terrans would decide. I understood now that the deciding had almost certainly happened long before that, in silence, on their own schedule, using methods we were never meant to notice at all. I sat with that realization for a long while, alone, in the same reading room where I had once spent an evening trying to convince myself I was imagining things. It changed, in a quiet but fundamental way, how I understood everything that had happened since. We had never been the ones evaluating an unknown species from a position of complete safety, the way every training document I had ever studied assumed we always were. We had been observed, assessed, and quietly measured by the very people we believed we were the ones measuring, for long enough beforehand that our own confidence survey, the one that had rated their military strength so low the chamber laughed aloud at it, had likely been read by someone on their side before we ever finished writing it ourselves. Director Corps offered me a new position not long after I filed my own quiet, unofficial note connecting the drone to the Absolution's arrival, a note I suspect she read far more carefully than anyone had ever read my original memo. The position had no exact precedent within the integration office, since it required overseeing something the office had never previously needed to oversee. Special liaison for ongoing contact with the Terran Compact, a role that required no integration paperwork at all, since there was no integration to plan for, only an open channel to be maintained between two parties who had agreed, formally and without warmth, to continue speaking to one another as equals, rather than as tribute payer and tribute collector. I accepted the position with feelings considerably more complicated than pride, though pride was certainly present among them. I understood. Taking on that role, that I remained an employee of the very system whose assumptions had nearly cost a great many lives across an entire correction fleet, a system that had promoted me, not because it had fully absorbed the lesson of what happened, but because it needed someone who understood the Terrans well enough to prevent that particular mistake from repeating itself in some new form. I decided, after turning the offer over for longer than Director Core probably expected me to, that I would rather shape the role from inside it than refuse it, and leave the shaping to someone with less reason to be careful. I thought, during those days of deciding, about Elder Thuvan Mar, and about whatever quiet, uncelebrated caution had shaped her entire long career after whatever she had witnessed centuries earlier. I did not know, accepting the position, whether I was choosing to become someone like her, patient and careful, and rarely thanked for either quality, or whether I was choosing something else entirely that I would not fully understand until I had lived inside it for a while myself. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I did not need to resolve that question before accepting the role. Some decisions, I was beginning to learn, mattered more for the direction they pointed in than for any certainty about where exactly they would end. My first formal duty in the new position was a modest one, a scheduled exchange of routine correspondence between our office and the Compact's external affairs staff, the kind of unglamorous administrative contact that would come to define most of my work in the years that followed. Owen Hale handled the exchange from the Terran side, and I found myself, preparing my opening message to him, remembering with unexpected clarity the exact tone he had used in that corridor months earlier, telling me that his people intended to use every one of their 30 days. I wrote to him plainly, without the formal diplomatic padding my training would once have insisted on, and asked, since we were now apparently meant to speak as something closer to equals, whether he might finally tell me what his people had actually spent those 30 days deciding. His reply arrived 2 days later, brief, in the same unhurried, unbothered tone I remembered from our first meeting. He wrote that his people had spent very little of the 30 days deciding anything at all, since the decision itself had never really been in question from the moment the terms were read aloud. What they had spent the time doing, he wrote, was making certain the rest of us understood that the answer was final, delivered calmly enough that we would not mistake its calm for an invitation to test it a second time. He added, almost as an afterthought, that he looked forward to a working relationship that required considerably less testing from either side going forward. I read that final line more times than I am willing to admit, searching for some hidden edge beneath its plainness, and found, in the end, only exactly what it appeared to be, a simple, calm statement of fact, offered without any need to dress it up as something gentler. I asked him in a later exchange whether he had known, standing in that corridor during our very first meeting, exactly how the following months would unfold. He wrote back that he had known considerably less than I probably assumed, and considerably more than the council had ever given his people credit for. He said his people had learned. Across a long history, the council's original survey had reduced to a single dismissive paragraph, that patience and surrender were not the same thing no matter how similar they might look from the outside while they were still happening. I copied that line into my own notes as well, beside the one from the delegate discussing questions once thought unsurvivable to ask, and found, reading them together, that they were describing the same discovery from two very different directions. Vesa retired from the integration office 2 years after the correction fleet's return, earlier than most analysts of her rank typically chose to, and told me, at the small gathering held in her honor, that she had spent her entire career believing patience and caution were simply personality traits some people happened to have, and others did not. She said she had come to believe, by the end, that they were something closer to disciplines, chosen deliberately and maintained with effort, and that she regretted not choosing them more deliberately herself during the years when a little more of both might have mattered. I did not know how to answer her kindly and honestly at the same time, so I simply thanked her for the small nods of agreement she had once given so freely, and for knowing, even when she eventually stopped offering them, exactly why she had stopped. I think about the drone often, even now, and about the 1,000 worlds that spent 9 centuries learning to fear whatever judgment the council might eventually hand down to them. We built an entire order on that fear, careful and patient and thorough, certain it would work on anyone we found, because it always had, right up until the one time it did not. I do not know yet what the 1,000 worlds watching us will decide to do with the knowledge that our judgment is no longer the only thing left to fear in this galaxy. I suspect, some nights, that they are only beginning to work that question out for themselves, quietly, the same way I once worked out mine, in old records nobody else thought worth reading closely. Denied was the first word we ever heard the Terrans say to us, delivered once, meant completely, offered without a single line of explanation attached to it. I have started to wonder, on the nights I let myself wonder about it at all, what word they might choose to say next, and to whom, and whether the rest of us will have the sense, this time, to listen the first time it is spoken.
What's up? $13 House Iced Tea Mash. I should have hit you. You're wide open. Was it early? I think my frees are like a 50.